Hello and welcome back again. You can find this exercise in the workbook in the Lesson 1 section. The exercise is similar to the previous exercise, but instead of counting up the grid squares, the hole positions are identified by ordinate dimensions. Now the X dimensions are here along the bottom. The Y dimensions for the holes are over to the left. And what we're about to do now is to work out the absolute coordinates for the hole centers positions 1 through 9. Now G90 is the code to let the CNC machine know that the coordinates are in absolute, and absolute coordinates are measured from the 0 position. The origin x0, y0 is located at the lower left of the part. So for our origin, x0, y0. Now let's start to figure out the hole positions for 1 through 9. Now the x-axis is running from left to right horizontally on the screen. The y-axis is lying vertically, and the z-axis is shooting along perpendicular to the screen. So let's work out the absolute coordinates for positions 1 through 9. Now for position 1, the x-axis value is 0.75 and the y-axis value is 0.5. Now let's figure out the remaining absolute coordinates by reading the dimensions from the drawing. Now in this absolute exercise, all the x and y values will be positive. So let's check out position 2. So the x value is going to be x 0.550. Now what about the y value? The y is going to be 2.375. Next up is position 3. Now what about the x? So the x is going to be 0.950, and for the y that's going to be 1.375. Next up is position 4, hole number 4. Now for the x, what do we got? 1.625, and for the y we have 1.875. Let's take a look at hole number 5. So for the x value we have 1.75, and for the y 0.75. Next up is hole number 6. And what's the absolute x for hole number 6? 2.450. And for the y, if I just move over to the left, 1.250. Next up is hole number 7. So the x value is x3. And if I just move over to the left, there's the y value, 0.35. Next up is hole 8. So the x value, if I move on down to the bottom, it's 3.250. Now if I just move over to the left, and the y value is 2.0. Next up is hole 9. Now for hole 9, the x value is 3.5. Now let's just scoot over to the left, and the y value is 0.95. So that's the absolute coordinates. Now we're changing gears, and for this exercise we're going to figure out the incremental coordinates for position 1 through 9. Now G91 is the code to let the CNC machine know that the coordinates are in incremental. And just a reminder, with incremental we're figuring out the distance from the last position to the next endpoint. And we also need to identify if it's a positive or a negative direction. So let's get cracking. So there's the origin. So from the origin to position 1, how much are we going to move in X and Y? Well, 0.75 along the X-axis and 0.5 up along the Y-axis, and both of these values are positive. Now let's figure out the remaining incremental coordinates and remember to work out if it's a positive or negative value. Now what about position 1 to position 2? Now imagine if you were walking from position 1 to position 2, how much would you move in the X-axis? Well, you move minus 0.2, negative 0.2. Now, how do we get this? So let's check out this 0.75 dimension minus the 0.55 dimension is 0.2. So that's how much we move in the X, negative 2. Now, how much would you move in the Y-axis from position 1 to 2? Well, you'd move 1.875. Now, how do we get that? 2.375 dimension minus this 0.5 dimension is 1.875. Now, let's figure out the remaining incremental values. Next up, what about position 2 down to position 3? How much would you move in the X-axis? Well, it would be positive 0.4. Now, how do we get that? The 0.95 dimension minus this 0.55 dimension is 0.4. Now, what about the Y? How much would you move in the Y-axis from 2 down to 3? Well, it's going to be negative 1. So what is that? How do we figure that out? So we've got the 2.375 dimension minus this 1.375 dimension. That's how we end up with this 1 inch. And as we're moving down in the Y negative direction, it's Y minus 1. So from 2 to 3, X 0.4 and Y minus 1. Next up, position 3 over to position 4. Now, how much would you move in the X-axis? Well, we'd move a positive value, 0.675. Now, how the heck do we get that? Well, check this 1.625 dimension minus the 0.95 dimension, and that's 0.675. Now, how much would you move in the Y-axis from 3 to 4? Well, a positive amount, 0.5. Now, how do we get that? The 1.875 dimension minus 1.375 is 0.5. So we're looking good. Next up, where are we off to? Position 4 down to position 5. How much would you move in the X-axis? Positive 0.125. Now, how the heck do we get that? Check this 1.75 dimension minus this 1.625 dimension for hole 4. The difference is 0.125. Now, how much would you move in the Y-axis from position 4 to 5? Well, a negative amount minus 1.125. Now, how do we get that? So let's check out the 1.875 dimension minus, just moving on down, minus this 0.75 dimension, and we end up with 1.125. So from 4 to 5, we're moving positive 0.125 in the X, and for the Y, negative 1.125. Now, you should pause the video and, using your CNC workbook, now work out the remaining incremental distances. Now, to check your answers, just hit the play button. Okay, now let's take a look at position 5 to 6. So from 5 to 6, how much would you move in the x-axis? Well, it would be positive 0.7. Now, how do we get that? The 2.45 dimension minus the 1.75 is 0.7. Now, how much would you move in the y-axis from position 5 to 6? It would be a positive amount, 0.5. Now, how do we get that? The 1.25 dimension minus the 0.75 dimension. Looking good. So from 5 to 6, x plus 0.7 and y plus 0.5. Moving on, 6 down to position 7. How much would you move in the x-axis? Well, it would be positive 0.55. Now, how do we get that? Well, the 3-inch dimension minus 2.450 is 550. Looking good. Now, how much would you move in the y-axis from 6 to 7? Well, that's a negative amount, 0.9. So, what have we got? The 1.25 dimension minus the 0.35 dimension will get us 0.9. So from 6 to 7, x plus 0.55 and y minus 0.9. Now, what about 7 up to position 8? How much would you move in the x-axis? Well, that would be a value in the x of positive 0.25. Now, how do we come by that? 3.25 dimension minus this 3-inch dimension will end up with a 1/4 inch. Now, how much would you move in the y-axis from 7 to 8? Positive 1.65. So, how do we get that? Here's this 2-inch dimension. So the 2-inch dimension minus the 0.35 dimension, you'll end up with 1.65. Looking good. Next up, 8 to 9. Now, how much would you move in the x-axis? Well, it would be a positive amount of 1/4 of an inch. Now, that's the 3.5 dimension minus the 3.25 dimension. Now you'll end up with 1/4 inch. Now, how much would you move in the y-axis from 8 to 9? Well, that's going to be a negative amount of minus 1.05. So, how do we get that? That's this 2-inch dimension minus this 0.95 dimension here, and you'll end up with 1.05. Now, next up, what about 9 back to the origin? How much would you move in the x-axis? Well, that would be a value of negative 3.5. So position 9 is 3.5 along the x-axis from the origin. Now, how much would you move in the y-axis from 8 to 9? Well, that would be negative 0.95. Now, position 9 is 0.95 along the y-axis from the origin. And that's all our whole positions worked out now. Now, this completes this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll be talking with you soon.